All right, everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about brain physiology. Specifically, we're going to be talking about neurons. Now, the neuron is the basic cell in the body that allows us to receive, process, and send information throughout the brain. So everything that we do, whether it's walking or talking or eating or thinking or making decisions, whatever it may be, is based on neurons communicating with one another throughout our entire brain. So before we start talking about the neurons, here's some interesting facts just to give you an idea of what we are talking about here. The brain is comprised of over 10 trillion neurons. And that just gives you an idea of how big these neurons actually are. And in fact, the human neuron is so small that when we do research, we actually study the neuron of a squid because they have the largest neurons of most animal species. And a neuron is a neuron. Doesn't matter if it comes from a squid, a monkey, a dog, a cat, a human, they're all the same. And they all just have the same basic processes, such as receiving, processing, and sending information. That's what they do. Now, the thing that's amazing about this, though, is that no two neurons physically touch one another. They communicate via what's called a chemical messenger, such as dopamine or norepinephrine or serotonin. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. Next, we also want to mention that in our brain, if I can actually get to work here, you're born with as many neurons as you're going to have your entire lifetime. So what this means is that when you're first born, you're going to have all 10 trillion of these neurons. And it's going to take time for the neurons to branch out and form their communications. That's why when babies are first born, all they can do is eat, sleep, and poop. But as they start to mature and get older, and the neurons start to grow and expand and form their communication networks, then we're able to walk and talk and so on and so forth. So it does take time for the brain to develop, and that's why it's going to be very important that we make sure that we have a healthy diet and get plenty of rest and all that, because that's going to help these neurons develop. Now, the only problem with this, though, is that if we have some type of accident, suppose that we have a stroke, or maybe we have some type of brain injury, and some of these neurons die off, we can't regenerate new neurons. Once they're gone, they're gone. And that's why sometimes when a person, for example, has a stroke, it's going to have permanent damage to the brain, such as paralysis on one part of the body, or maybe a speech impediment, something like that, because that part of the brain has been damaged. Those neurons have been lost, and we can't regain it back. And this is also very problematic for certain types of neurological disorders, such as Alzheimer's disease, because with Alzheimer's is that once the neurons start to die off, then the disease becomes more and more progressively worse. For example, what starts off as simple forgetting, I forgot to take my medicine, or forget what day it is, turns into I can't remember or recognize family members anymore. So as more and more of these neurons start to die off, the disease becomes more problematic. Hopefully, though, they'll be able to find ways to slow down the progression of the disease, but once a person has it, there's not much we can do to actually cure it, unfortunately. So anyways, let's start off by talking about the different types of neurons. There's 3 different types. We have what are called sensory neurons, we have motor neurons, and we have interneurons. And as the slide mentioned, they each have specific functions, even though they are basically the same. Sensory neurons have special sensory receptors that are located throughout the body that receive sensual information, such as sight, sound, touch, and so on. So we'll have sensory neurons in our ears, along our skin, and so on, that receives the sensory information. We also have motor neurons that sends motoric information from the brain or the spinal column out to the muscles. And finally, the majority of the neurons that are in the brain are called interneurons. And their job is to send information from one neuron to another to another. So a vast majority of these are going to be interneurons that are found throughout the brain. Now let me just go over real quickly to show you how this all actually works. A spinal reflex is the most basic bodily movement that we have in the body. And it must involve these 3 neurons: a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, and an interneuron. So what's going to happen is that suppose you put your hand on a hot stove. So in the diagram right here, a finger is placed on a hot stove. What's going to happen is that a sensory receptor in the fingers are going to detect the sensation of heat. This is going to travel along this red sensory neuron all the way into our spinal column. Then, right here, this little black interneuron is going to communicate that information from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. And what the motor neuron is going to do is it's going to travel out to the muscles in the fingers and cause the fingers to retract so that you take your hand off the stove. Now, this is going to happen very, very quickly. We don't even have to think about it. This is a basic reflex. And in fact, what happens is that when a baby's first born, when the nurses take the baby away and they're doing their little Apgar scale on the baby, one of the things that they actually do test is their spinal reflex. And what they'll do is they'll get a little pencil, rub it along the base of the foot of the baby, and make sure that the toes curl, because that means that the spinal reflex is actually working. Also, if you had a physical to play sports, you probably had the patellar tendon reflex tested. That's where they get the little hammer and whack the patellar tendon on your knee to make sure your foot kicks up. That's just to make sure that your reflexes in the spinal column are actually working. Now, while this is taking place, you also have another interneuron that goes from the spinal column all the way up to the brain. And when it reaches the brain, this is when we finally detect the sensation of pain. Now you'll notice that it's much quicker to do the spinal reflex just lifting up your finger than to have to wait to decide that, oh my gosh, my hand's on a hot stove, I'm burning my fingers, it feels painful, I should lift them up. So you can see that the spinal reflex can be very quickly. It will take a little bit more time for the reflex to get to the brain where it's been processed for the sensation of pain, but that's the way it basically works. And then all basic functions that we do in the body, like we said, walking, talking, eating, and so on, is going to involve these three neurons communicating with one another. Now, instead of just having three working together for a spinal reflex, it's going to take thousands, if not millions, working together to just do simple bodily functions. So, kind of amazing when you think about it, but that's how these neurons kind of work together. Now, here's a picture of a neuron. These are the different parts of the neuron that we're going to be talking about. First, we have these little branch-like structures called dendrites. This is what's sticking out of the neuron right here. This big area right here in the center is called the soma, or the cell body. And that little round thing right there is going to be the nucleus. This long, thin fiber is called the axon. And then the endpoints on the axon are called the terminal buttons, or the synaptic knobs. So sometimes they have different terminology for the same parts. That's just the way it is. So we'll use the ones that are consistent with what you're going to see within the actual textbook. So first, let's talk about the dendrites. Their job is to receive a chemical message from other neurons. So on your dendrites, there's going to be specialized receptors that have different shapes that we'll talk about later when we talk about neurotransmitters. And they receive these chemical messages. And there's been some interesting research that's been done on these messengers. And what they have found out is that a researcher, her name is Marie Diamond. She used to teach at the University of California at Berkeley. And she was able to do research with Einstein's brain. And she discovered that the reason why, or she hypothesized that the reason why he was much smarter than the average person is that he had more of these dendrites located all over his brain. And so what she then did is some research studies with laboratory rats to find out if this is true. And so in her studies, what she did is that after the rats were born, she then raised them into three different types of environments. So one was called the impoverished environment. This is where all they had was just a food cup and a water bowl, and that's it. The other one, they had a food cup, a water bottle, and a running wheel, and all the different types of toys to play with. And so she hypothesized by having all this stimulation, it should produce more of this dendritic growth. And so what happened is that when the rats grew up, she then trained them to run through a maze to find a piece of cheese. And what she found out is that those rats who were raised in the environment that had all the stimulation actually learned to run the maze quicker. And then when the rats did this, she then anesthetized the rats to look at their brains and see what happened to the brain. And what she noticed is that the rat brains that had the stimulation in their environment had thicker brains, heavier brains, and they also had more of these dendrites. So that's why a lot of pediatricians today will suggest that when you have a baby, you stimulate it. You put those little mobiles above its crib, you play music for them, you talk to them, you interact with them, because the more that you do that, the more it's going to develop the brain. And we're going to talk more about this in another chapter on child development, how we can actually foster the brain doing this. Next, we have the cell body, or the soma. This is where the chemical message is then going to be processed. And what's going to happen is that we have what are called neurotransmitters. These are the chemical messengers. They're going to take that chemical message and then send it to another neuron. Okay. Now, in order for this to happen, these chemical messengers have to travel long down the axon. So this is going to be that long, thin, tube-like structure that we showed you in the first picture. And what we have here are synaptic vesicles. These are like little boats, if you will. They have the neurotransmitters inside. They're going to float down the axon. And the way that they do this is an electrical impulse. And so what's going to happen is that when the electrical impulse starts, it's going to cause these vesicles to travel down the axon. And the special area called the axon hillock is where this neural impulse or this electrical charge is actually going to start. And so once again, I'll show you a picture of this in a minute, once again, just to review all this for you. Now, in order to have very fast information processing, we have what's called myelin sheath. This is insulation that comes from other neurons that wraps around the axons to allow a faster chemical charge to take place. And so what's going to happen is, suppose that at home, on your desk, you have a lamp. And your dog comes by and starts chewing on the electrical cord. And some of the wires get exposed. What you'll notice is that when that happens, there's not a clear circuit that goes from the wall to your lamp. And so the light may flicker off and on, off and on, off and on. And so in order to have a nice smooth flow of electricity from the wall to your lamp, you're then going to insulate it with electrical tape. And so this is the same process here. To have a very smooth process from sending the information from the cell body down through the axon, we're going to have this insulation from these other types of cells called Schwann cells that's going to allow this process to take place. So here's an example of a neuron that has a myelin sheath surrounding it. These little spaces here are called the nodes of Ranvier. That's where electrical impulse is going to jump from node to node to node to allow the faster chemical transmission. Here's a picture of a neuron that has no myelin sheath. And so what you'll see is that because of this, it's going to have slower chemical transmission and also a slower, if not a lost signal going from the brain out to the muscles. And so what can happen here is that if a person has motor neurons in their motor cortex that don't have the myelin sheath surrounding it, it can lead to problems in motoric behavior. For example, they may have slow movements, maybe disjointed movements, that they may walk with a limp, or they may walk with need to have a cane to help them walk, or whatever. And there are certain types of neurological disorders that are based on the fact that a person does not have myelin sheaths surrounding the motor neurons, and that's going to be what's called, if anyone out there knows what it is, muscular sclerosis. So MS is actually caused by a lack of myelin sheath surrounding the motor neurons. And the problem with that is that there's no way that we can fix this. You just can't go in the brain and fix all these neurons and put myelin sheath around their axons. It's not going to happen. So the sad thing is that once you have MS, there's really no cure for it. We know what causes it, we know what the problem is, but there's nothing we can do to actually treat it. Finally, we have the terminal buttons. These are going to be the endpoints of the neural transmitters. And so that's where the chemical messengers will be released into the liquid-filled space. And that is what we call the synapse. So anyways, I think here's another diagram that may help explain this a little bit better. Here's your axon right here. This is the neural impulse coming down the axon. These little round circles here are the synaptic vesicles. The little round dots inside are called the neural transmitters. And so when these vesicles travel down the axon, get down to the terminal buttons, they'll be released into this little liquid-filled space right here called the synapse. And then they're going to bind to a receptor on the next neuron, and the process starts all over again. So anyways, that's the basics for the neuron. We'll talk about neurotransmitters in the next video. So if you guys have any questions, make sure you send me an email, post a question on the Q&A discussion board, or post something on Pronto. All right, we'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.